one of the things that was really interesting was snowboarding didn't really have a culture of training. So I thought they'd be really anti the gym, and they weren't. They were super open to everything. So the culture was very, okay, give us more. We're super keen to do this. And the first couple of years, the guys, it was really building a base of physical fitness, and they were quite young. So the guys I started off with were probably 15, and they're now 21.
Robert, how are you, dear boy?
I'm good, buddy. How are you doing?
Good. I think Fernando asked via text before we started, how long we'd known each other. And I think next to Tappers, you're probably one of the people that I've known longest in strength and conditioning. So honored to have you.
Thanks very much, man. It's good to have lasted so long.
Yeah.
So... and that definitely for me raises a couple of questions, because I've known Keir for like what, 7, 8 yeyears. I'm just double guessing myself. So you know him for 12. So I'm like, what's wrong with him?
What dirt does he have on me? No, I mean, give people the context of how we met.
I think we met when I was working at Middlesex University and Harrow School. So I was teaching on the sports rehab and masters in S&C, and then I was heading up the high performance unit at Harrow School, and you were working at Wasps. And then essentially interning at Wasps. And I think what we did there, and what I think worked really well across that, was reaching out to the different clubs and trying to see what we could do together to make life easier for everybody. So, what skill sets did you have at Wasp? What skill sets did we have where we were? What were we trying to, were we double bubbling on work? How could we make our lives easier? And then, we brought Exos over, or Athlete Performance at the time, and hosted them, and then connected you guys up. Connected quite a few people up with Athlete Performance and Exos at the time. I think that was it.
I owe you my career.
You don't. I think it was a very good conduit. I think it's the right place, right time. Just saying, giving a few people a nudge to connect with them in Europe at the time. So it was that was really good to see how your career just went like that, man.
It went nuts in 1 year. I mean, how did you you started out at St. Mary's, right?
My undergrad was in St. Mary's, so I was one of the first years of sports rehab, and then I actually was working I left, and there wasn't an awful lot of S&C then, but I kind of was like, when I was doing therapy, people would get better and come back, and exercise started to fix that, and I was personal training, and I ended up running clinics and setting clinics up through big corporate box gym, and doing rehab as a product. So I had a big background in kind of rehab, clinical rehab, and in the wellness space. And while I was doing that, I was still working with teams and kind of doing that to it paid better than working with teams. Essentially, still does. Still does. So that ran for a good few years, and then I started lecturing alongside that, and still continued to kind of consult and work with teams the whole way through, and eventually kind of end up in that niche of being a therapist and being an S&C, and kind of the niche was that rehab in the middle of. And I don't like rehab as the term, because it's just not allowing somebody to become less good an athlete and trying to maximize performance and get them back to performance as fast as possible with the least risk of re-injury afterwards. That was kind of the space I ended up working in. And then the LTID stuff. So I started doing a lot of stuff with schools in the private school sector in the UK, and eventually kind of went through a couple of them and ended up at Harrow while teaching at Middlesex. So those were kind of around the same time. So Middlesex was 9 years and Harrow was 8 years. And then from there,
I remember at that time, you had, in terms of the system, been kissed on the cock, because you managed to have 2 jobs that were basically full-time salaries and do them both at the same time. And I was like, this guy's got it made.
They weren't full-time. One was a full-time salary. And one was I got a consultancy rate. So I wasn't paid massively, but at Harrow, because I had time off, or a job share with the university, so it was okay. It was good money. but I wasn't there full time at Harris. So I was two days a week and 1 day at the weekends. So it was a lot of hours. Like in the week, it was probably 50, 60 hours like anybody else who works in the sport, and then the traveling games. And then from there, I got interviewed in the Netherlands for the role as head of physical performance for ski and snowboard, para and able-bodied.
Did your relationship with your missus precede the interview in the Netherlands, or the other way around?
I was with my missus for 2 years before, so we were dating over and back between the Netherlands. So she had work in London, and then she kind of. It was fine. She was in London a lot, and so it was. Yeah, it was. No, if she lived in North London, I'd have seen her as much as I saw her. If I lived in South London.
The year that I moved to Australia, I think I saw more of my parents and my sister over those next 2 years than I did when I was living in, like Leeds and.
Yeah. You just make it work. So we had flexibility in our jobs to move around between it. I lived right by Heathrow. She lives right by Schiphol. So she found the job. I was like, no. She sent it to me again. I said no. And then I did the interview, and what they wanted intrigued me. So it was a big step out of rugby, which kind of at the time, I think, that's probably been one of the most positive things, to leave a sport and go into something completely different, with a completely different culture and different views and different attitudes, and then see how are you the limiting factor in success within the sport that you're in, and it's the culture ingrained you into believing certain things. So bringing stuff from that sport was great, but also learning from those sports has been, I think I'd be completely different going back into rugby or back into a team sport environment from what I've learned with these athletes.
What would you say is like those cultural differences are? How are they different?
I would say snowboard. So within different countries, there's differences in the cultural aspects of where snowboarding is. I mean, if you're in Canada, the kids grow up in the mountains, and the big mountain guys who get pulled by doing other extreme sports. In the Netherlands, it's a flat country with no mountains. So the kids grow up doing it in snowdomes. So it's quite an urban sport. So the guys like the coffee, and they've got some other interests, and there isn't as much. Some of our athletes, that's what everybody thinks. And
they're okay athletes. That's what I'm trying to say. They're okay.
Yeah, that's what everybody thinks, but not so much in the Netherlands. And really within that sport, the perception of it is that it's stoner dudes, and they're not. They're all pretty smart, intellectual people who are very motivated and at the extreme end, insane athletes. Physically, I'm just super impressed by those guys compared to most sports that I've worked with. So that's been an interesting journey. So yeah, the thing that I probably would have learned is you can do way less and get a insane performance. I think we overtrain people to the max in every other sport. Like our guys can go away for a month and not be able to train and come back and be in really good shape. They're doing their sport. But I think as a strength coach, we feel the need to over deliver to protect our jobs.
Especially in nutritional contact sports, I feel like there's a mental aspect to that where they're afraid of what's going to happen if they don't train.
Yeah. When is this going to air? Just as a quick question.
When do you want it
to? Okay, cool. After the 28th. So yeah. I would say, I'll give you an example. So our guys, in the research, they go up to 30 days for maximal strength, but no one takes that risk. Well, in this sport, you're forced to take that risk because they might not have access. And what we saw is we don't see a degradation in maximal strength or power, or they actually sometimes get better because they have the rest and recovery to express that better. And our motto for our program was that physical training would never be, their physical ability would never be the limiting factor to them having time on the mountain to perfect their sport. So kind of what you talk about a lot is that the skill is the most important thing. And we're a servant of the skill. And what we are doing is making them physically prepared that they can be on snow as much as possible, be ready to train when they need to, be able to learn things faster. So for us, if we take snowboarding, freestyle, whoever can learn a trick faster and put it down with the most consistency with the least amount of risk is the kid that's probably going to win. If you spend all your time just on that, and they crash and break and they're at the lowest physical level, the journey back is really hard. So it takes a really long time. So they have to be, I would say, conditioned for the inevitability of being fucked up.
Nice.
Because I talked about it recently, people don't like hearing it, but it has the highest injury rate of any Olympic sport.
Really?
Yeah, so I think it's, yeah, that, and there's one other, but freestyle is massive. It's huge. And it's breaks. So we don't have little hammy tears. We have air ambulance.
It's always fucking serious, right? Like you just fly in the air, turning like 1,000 degrees, and you fall with your face. It's not going to be like, you know, tendonitis from my rotator cuff.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of that. we get air ambulance, and they're going getting a pin and a plate, and you know, that's essentially what we see is big traumatic orthopedic issues. And the window for the guys is kind of 16 to 24. You've people above that, but that's when people are winning medals in Olympics. So essentially you want them to be, and also you got weather. So you need very good weather. It's expensive to be there. So you want people who are able to perform when the conditions are right, because you know, there's a big camp every year in Saas-Fee, which is at about 3,000 meters on a glacier. If you're there for 2 weeks, you might get 5 days training. So your number of days versus investment in time could be quite low. So you want to be physically fit enough to be able to train, to be able to recover quickly from training sessions, not have any physical fitness element detract from your ability to learn a skill and a complex skill. So, you know, the guys are traveling between 50 and 70 kilometers an hour while reading the wind conditions while they go off a jump that's 3-4 stories high, while they do a 1,400 degree spin in the air while inverted, and then try and pick a landing spot.
Nice.
So, yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of what you're preparing them from. So yeah, that is probably the freestyle snowboarding. Then if you take like board across where the guys are riding courses, which can be 45 seconds to 2 minutes, and they're doing multiple laps, and those are working on features, they got to be conditioned enough to express that power while going down, read lines. So if you know they're doing a lot of laps and a lot of training on a course, you want them to be fit enough to be able to do that. And then you have the things that maybe in team sports that we're better at, which is the nutritional aspect, the hydration aspect, you know, that's all dialed in rugby. Whereas I would have said in snow sports, not so much. Like guys will take a sandwich up the mountain at altitude where it has a higher metabolic demand, where they're wearing equipment that makes them sweat and has a thermal environment. So weight loss, so all the work that you do in the off season could be lost in one training camp where they lose 2 kg of lean body mass just because their metabolic rate is so high. So, you know, looking at hydration, food solutions on the mountain, eating regularly, those were some of the things that you would see that maybe team sports do a little bit better. One of the things that was really interesting was snowboarding didn't really have a culture of training. So I thought they'd be really anti the gym, and they weren't. They were super open to everything. So the culture was very, okay, give us more. We're super keen to do this. And the first couple of years, the guys, it was really building a base of physical fitness, and they were quite young. So the guys I started off with were probably 15, and they're now 21. So the first couple of years were like, can we get as much work done as possible to create a great base, to allow more time then after that to do more camps, to have more time on snow, to do other things. So create a great base in physical conditioning, try and get that started earlier with the younger kids coming through. So our youngest program is about 12 upwards, so that by 15, 16, they have a reasonably good base, and by 18, their S&C is kind of done. You know, you're just refining after that. And that gives them the space to go out and enjoy the snow more and practice more and be.
I always felt that was the way in rugby. Like by the time they were 23, the bed was made. It's just like if you're 23 and you're able to make significant physical improvements, it tells me that you're not playing a lot.
I would agree with you. I think at Harrow, that was the thing that we talked about this actually, was that and Tappers and I talked about this, that really the academies are the people that set. It always amuses me when people go put less value on an academy role. I think it is the cornerstone to athletic performance. Yeah. Because if you get somebody from 13 to 18, that's a brilliant block of training, taking into consideration the physical, emotional, and mental maturity of the kid. You have the opportunity to develop and help them be a better person, be better physically, and get them to a point where essentially the work's done. If they go off to a club, our goal at Harrow was, when the kid leaves here, we have given them all the skill sets they need, no matter what club they go to. So if they went to you, we knew they weren't to Olympic lifting. If we went to somebody else, they might love Olympic lifting. But we were like, we'll teach
Irish
them
fucking powerlifters.
I didn't want to say that, but
yeah, I said it for you. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, that's okay. So our view was quite holistic. Was we'll give them the broad spectrum. We'll make sure when we work with the clubs, we'll cover the KPIs they want us to work on. Yeah. We'll look at how that athlete is, or that kid is, as a person, and look at how we develop them in conjunction with the club, and see what added value we can give to them. And then essentially when we hand them out into the world from that environment at 18, 99% of the work's done, and they are able to go anywhere and be, one, intellectually mature enough to ascertain whether the program they're getting is good or not good, and realize this is a bit of poop and I need to maybe look at some stuff myself. Or they go, this is different, but it's articulated to me in the right way and I trust it, but it might have a different strand to what we did with them. But they're physically able to do that. So that was a goal for us. As
an aside, it's a little bit off topic, but that was one of the things that I grew up going to state school, and then you go to a Harrow, which, Winston Churchill went there. There's all these like movers and shakers of the world that go to Harrow. The one thing that you notice about those kids coming out of those schools is they never, ever, ever expected to fail in life. And I always wondered if that was like a chicken or an egg, where is it the money and the environment that you're brought up in that leads to the attitude? Or I just found it very, very interesting.
I've worked across a lot, like between state, and I think it is the culture that is perpetuated within it. I think money has the opportunity to add more to the culture, but I've seen it in state schools where the culture is just as good. So I think it's probably inherently rolls over there a little.
To select and to turn people away as well, right? So it's
They do. They have the ability to do that as well. But I think also it's a very old school, so its culture is quite cemented. They have a foundation of longevity within that culture. But one of the things I saw that was a great leveler is kids are not that athletic. You could be at a state school or at a private school or public school, and most kids don't move well anymore. That was the biggest leveler. So in terms of, I think the thing with kids in those private or public schools is that they have way more pulls on them and way more opportunity. So they're being pulled to music, they're being pulled to drama, they're being pulled to business aspects, whereas maybe in some of the state schools, the kids have one or two clear focuses. So it can be a detractor, but it can also add, it can make you well-rounded, but it can also just pull you away from
that was actually for us, the biggest frustration for us, selfishly for the pro sports team, is that your boys used to do so much sport that it's just impossible. You remember Louis? Like, it was impossible to get weight on that kid because they're doing like 2 hours of PE a day and they're doing rep pro. Like, well, it's exactly what you said.
I think that probably changed through the time that we were there, that they realized the kids their journey is to be a professional athlete, that the director of sport, Jesse, was very good in that he, over that period of time, kind of created pathways for that to exist within the school, because it didn't exist before he got there. But equally, one of the things I liked the most about that environment was the school isn't what people think it is. It's super level. We had kids coming in on scholarships there, which was one of the best parts, who came in and potentially their pathway was to be a professional athlete. And the opportunities that presented themselves at the school and through the academic side of things. We had kids who came out the other end who were like, we one kid who was, I'm pretty sure would have been a pro athlete and was like, I want to be a doctor, and I now can be a doctor. I've made the grades, I've got in, I'm going to go be a doctor, and was super stoked about that. And that was his journey. So it just created more avenues for him. So I think both state schools and private schools have their flaws, have their benefits. But I think it all comes down to culture. You can have a great school with great culture and you'll create great people. Culture is king.
All right, let's bring it back to snow sports.
Yeah.
Just real quick, do you do the skiing as well as the snowboarding, or just snowboarding?
I do skiing as well, but I haven't had many able-bodied, so it's predominantly para ski, so sit ski and single leg. So mainly the para ski group that I work with are sit skiers who have different levels. So either they're below knee amputees or they have paralysis. And then I have one or two CP athletes, and I have had a couple of single leg skiers, so they ski on one leg.
Talk to me about that, because I mean, obviously the tendency is to lump them in and say, oh, Paralympic athletes, but that's like some huge differences right there. How do you, because obviously with the number of athletes that you're working with staff for an organization, you have to have some kind of system to what you do. How do you make that fit such a broad array of different disabilities?
I think we are the only program in the world that trains our able-bodied and adaptive athletes together.
Really?
So and the reason we did that or chose to do that was, I think it creates a separation, and there's elements around the culture and language of what you use. We've been very lucky in that people are not so sensitive to language in the Netherlands. So if you talk across the board about adaptive, I use the term adaptive, our athletes like that term more. I think it's more fitting than para. Adaptive, because the sport's just adapted. So one of the things when we got there was speaking with the athletes and the coaches was they really want to have a culture of this. This is the same as respected, the same level as able-bodied, which it should be. It should be viewed and get the same sort of television and input. But for that to happen, they've got to be training at the same level. So if you want that respect, you got to live that journey. So by putting all the groups together and training at that level, that culture is perpetuated through it to, the Dutch para ski program is one of the best in the world. We've multiple world champions in para snowboard and para ski. I think the hard thing with it is generally looking at not so much the disability, but a lot of people want to do stuff that looks like it's able-bodied and going, okay, well, just because it looks like it might not be what's going to get you on a podium. So attacking it as what's going to make the boat go faster, what's going to get you on a podium. So is your prosthetic leg crap? Is that a limiting factor? A lot of people put it on the prosthetic leg. No, you're just not fit. You're not strong. So it's not your leg. It's that. Or is your skill level not great? So what do we do? And this was a great learning curve working with the coaches, in that it's sitting and doing a needs analysis of what do they need, where do you need them to be, where should they be in 4 years, and what at a physical level do they need to do that. So, if somebody's prosthetic could be the limiting factor, but they're really not fit or not strong, do we need to get that leg straight away? Maybe not, because it's a big financial investment. Let's look at timelining the physical improvement and the technical improvement to earn the right for that new prosthetic. And then when do we drop that new prosthetic in? So we've had some people, who they didn't forecast when they would get a new prosthetic, and it weighs 2 kg more. That changes you. Also the mechanics, some of the guys, could squat to parallel on some of their prosthetics, others full depth. So if you suddenly are only able to squat to parallel and we give you way more range, how are we going to address that? How are we going to look at it? So essentially we do a needs analysis of where they are technically, where they are physically, what they potentially are limiting factor, like you would do in any sport, and then train for that.
Sorry.
Go on.
I was just linking a couple of things that you mentioned, and just remember a bit of my time back in Australia when they were talking about, the para athletes getting adapted to an environment, and depending on which, say if they're missing a limb, how that affects metabolically, sweating rates, what they can do, what they cannot do. So I was just linking all that together. So I imagine it becomes really specific. So it's not that you can get and say, hey, this is what we'll do for, X, Y, and Z, because each individual, even with the same or similar, I don't want to say disability, but you know what I mean, like adaptation, they might have, huge differences in preparation, and something that's not definitely sets and reps in the gym, isn't it?
It's the same as what you would get if you look at pods of athletes. You try and put pods of athletes together in the gym, and essentially that's what we do. We put pods of athletes together who, one, spacing. Are you going to be able to switch in and out between that exercise without tons of transitions? That's really annoying for a lot of para athletes. If you have to get in and out of your wheelchair a bunch of times, that can be quite annoying. So over time, we listened to what the athletes enjoyed and looked at the physiology and did that affect the outcome that we're trying to check. So if we give you too long rest, are you going to get hypertrophy? Maybe not. If we give you too short rest, are we going to get the power outcomes that we want? So, how do we look at getting the outcome that we want in an environment that works for those athletes? And then putting them into pods. I mean, we have some para athletes that their training partners able-bodied because they're on the same weights, they have a relatively or very close weights, they have a very similar program because it meets the outcomes of what they want. So it's just individualized training. I think probably the difference is I'm not so phased with it because of having a rehab background. So the level of mental prep that I have to put in to put together a program that might have I don't like the term rehab, but an adaptation in it is not that much of a challenge for me. There is a bit of what equipment do we have? How do we space it out? How do we make it work? But essentially, yeah, able-bodied and para can train together pretty much all the time. Wheelchairs take up a bit more space, and sometimes to give them more, to have a better training session for them if they don't want to transition so much, and they want to be on one piece of kit and move the bench up and down, then obviously that might have an effect in timing. So those are some of the things you factor in. But yeah, able-bodied and para together, view them the same way. Try not to focus on exercises that they look like they're able-bodied, but look on the best exercise or the best thing that will get the outcome they're looking for. So we look at outcomes and work back from that. So
in terms of the demands,
yeah,
as an outsider looking at those sports, the one thing that I would worry me would be like those eccentric demands. Like you say, somebody takes a jump 3 or 4 stories high. What kind of loads are they having to handle when they land, and how are you preparing them for that, tracking it? Do you do like a lot of like diagnostic testing in terms of jumps?
Yeah, so the interesting thing that we saw, I would say probably so there's no prizes for not landing. So it's an eccentric sport. You've got speed, if you ride well, you've got the speed going in. There is some, in surfing, they saw that if you can come off the lip higher, you have more time in the air, which gives you an ability to access potentially a more complex trick. Yeah. Essentially, we'd probably say that could be the same thing in snowboarding, but there isn't any data on that. But the conversations with people around that would suggest that. However, you're not always trying to jump as hard as you can jump because you're reading the wind. There's more elements that they're reading in, so they have to pick up on the wind direction and read all of that as they're coming in and spot a landing. So to get back to your point, what we looked at was, one, they're super symmetrical. The guys are, because they have to do tricks off both sides. So with a lot of the younger guys, if they haven't ridden switch or they haven't got the full suite of tricks together, they might have an asymmetry. The other thing is if the guys are working on a trick on one side because they're not great at it, they might come back from the snow being more asymmetrical. But our best guys on force plates have sometimes zero asymmetry on jumping. Like, it's insane. It's way below the margin of error, and it's consistent. So that's just nuts. And we would certainly, like you said the other day, below 10 is where you want to see people. 10 for us is quite high. So we're normally below. yeah. So we're normally we're below 5 is kind of our norm for the guys who've been in the program for a while. So if you got a kid, and again, because some of them are quite young, they'll come in with asymmetries and those should iron out. And through the season, you speak to the coach and go, hey, have they been doing a switch? Have they been riding switch? Yeah, that last camp, we ended up working on switch trick for ages. Okay, that's why their asymmetry is there. So asymmetry is probably not good. We do a lot of force plate stuff. So we generally give the guys their concentric scores because that's what they're into. They want to know how high they jump. Then we look at RSI. Is not that they ever have to have that very fast reactive jump.
Yeah.
Maybe in slopestyle. So for people who don't know, there's big air, which is just one big trick, and then slopestyle is basically like a skateboard park where they do a bunch of different tricks and they get graded on it. So that fast reactivity we kind of see as their ability to do a trick and switch back another way, or jump suddenly onto a rail and off a rail again. But most of the guys, their RSI on a drop jump is 3.5 or above.
That's high.
Yeah. If you watch, there's a sports science documentary that shows what an elite snowboarder is like compared to a rugby player, and sprinting wise, jumping wise, they just smoke everybody. And pretty much our 65 kg guy was cleaning 120 and back squatting 2.5 times body weight.
That's like Fernando. Fernando's like one of those ants.
I have like zero skills, so I wouldn't be able to get into a snowboard or rugby field, but I can do that.
So the other thing is mass. We need a certain amount of mass on their upper body, but not huge. So they tend to be actually relatively short guys as well, which is good for me. I'm not working in the Netherlands with the volleyball program, which is good because I'm short. I feel embarrassed the whole time in the Netherlands for my hobbitness. So they tend to be short, relatively compact guys, kind of like almost like your BMX guy, big legs, a little bit smaller upper body, but they need a degree of muscle to take an impact if they fall and protect them.
Because that upper lower body relationship with body mass will definitely have a huge impact in, shifting center of gravity. So you don't want like any unbalances on the top, whereas if you move a limb on your upper body, you just lose control of what you're trying to do with your legs, right? That's the sort of...
Yeah. And most of the guys are doing grabs, so they're grabbing the board. So, if you're big, you have to come down to meet the board. So we also do drop jumps with the guys from 30 and 60 centimeters. Most of the guys' 60 centimeter drop jump is as high as their drop jump, if not higher than their 30, particularly in season. We do super maximally centric work on a K-box. We measure their force, and that came about from... We're not going to be able to drop them 5 stories and measure them on a force plate. Doesn't work.
Maybe in China.
Maybe in China. Also, they land on an angle, and if you land on the sweet spot, the force is not very hard. It's not much. Yeah, the sweet spot. So, but if you land on the knuckle, so the landing part, you've got to flap it, and then it drops away like this, and you want to land about here. Yeah. If you land here or here, it's not good. Or if you land really deep. It's air ambulance time. So essentially what you're conditioning them for, if they land well, it's really easy. Or not really easy, but it's relatively safe. If they land deep or short, that's what you're conditioning for when it goes wrong. Most of your conditioning is for when it goes wrong. Or you can see it. We did some analysis. We saw some riders who were technically brilliant, and they would land and they would bottom out, so they would collapse through and their butt would hit the ground. And if you get your setup turns right, this is from speaking to the technical coaches, generally you're in the air will be good. And then if you land with the board in the right way, you should ride out of it every time if it's on the sweet spot. And we saw some riders not able to do that, and that was their ability to absorb force. Their eccentric strength was not good enough, and that ability to communicate S&C terms into this is why this athlete is not landing that trick, because they're like, they should land that. You just kept asking why, and they came back to they're not strong enough. And then we started working on that. So we do a lot of drop squats with them as well. We just started looking at the force plate work on a drop squat.
Oh, like a drop catch.
Like drop catch, yeah. Snatch balances, super maximally centric work on the K-box. That came across because the athletes liked it, and they said it felt like when they did a bad landing. And then we can measure that and see what kind of level that is. The next level, if I stayed, because again, the kids were quite young, so some of your testing, they're just on a trajectory like this. So how much does that data mean anything? With the senior guys now, some of that data does mean stuff. So I'm kind of trawling back through the last year at the moment, looking at what our force plate data tells us. Generally fairly symmetrical on a landing. So we look at super maximally centric on the K-box. We look at time to stabilization, didn't present tons of stuff to us. speed of eccentric braking. So how fast can they kill a landing, and absorb force. Those are the things that we kind of look at.
In terms of the conditioning, obviously when you're in like running, you have that flight time. In other activities or like cycling, you're going to be unlocking your legs so you can clear like some of those metabolites. Is it right that was, snowboard and skiing, you're constantly between that inner and outer range, like tons of muscular tension the whole time? Are they naturally just well conditioned for that stuff, or do you have to top it up?
Depends on the discipline. So for freestyle, the Dutch have a really nice word for a leopard. It's called a leidpaard, which is a lazy horse. They essentially are they essentially are alactic. They just jump and land. That's it.
Yeah.
So it's a pure expression of power, gymnastic skill, and ability to manipulate and make shapes in the air, and then absorb landing. That's freestyle. And then they get graded on creativity and the use of the park. The park might be a minute, but they're cruising. They're not sending it.
Okay.
So
like downhill racing, for example.
Downhill is completely different. So if you take downhill or you take border cross where they're riding a course, that they're pumping to go over obstacles. They have a lot of occlusion, which you can kind of train for that stuff. They're under tension the whole time, kind of mid-range to inner range. Some in very deep ranges. Skiing is slightly different, but when snowboarding is kind of mid-range the whole time. However, what you don't account for is the vibration. So you're going over something that's doing that. And I think that's one of the things where you get the most amount of metabolic demand is dealing with vibration. So that's very hard to replicate on dry land. Even if you go to the snow domes, they're too short. So, and if you look at some of the research in skiing, it's the same, that people are less conditioned at the end of the off season, and then they get more conditioned at those things because they're doing the sport. So the sport, also competing, is not training. So you might do 2 runs in a day in a competition and 10 runs in training. So if you take maybe
it's almost like American football, like you're training to get them ready for camp so they don't break in camp, as opposed to the competition.
Yeah, and also to learn a technical skill at high velocity. So
can't be done in 2 runs.
Yeah. So what you're doing is trying to make, they have decent recovery. So you've probably got 15 minutes before you back up on a chairlift again, or, maybe 30 minutes between runs. But again, you got weather, cold, standing around. Power, there's some slightly different, but if you take able-bodied, so you've got a reasonably decent recovery between each run. Runs are anything from 45 seconds to 2 minutes. So you're in lactic right up to getting into aerobic, but you're still having to contract and have huge amounts of occlusion and heart rates that can be well over maximal. So it's essentially the training that we would do a lot of for them would be leg strength endurance. We do some VO2 max to give a base, because the start of the year they're probably at altitude. So even just existing, having a reasonably, there's not a correlation with having a very high VO2 max and success, but having a reasonably high one gives you a good base also for illness. So one of the other things you get is some of the snowboard guys have very low body comps. So if you get sick, you get pretty sick. And then we look at your ability to tolerate time under tension with vibration and occlusion. And you can play, and that we don't do, I get slammed a bit that I don't do a lot of balancing and wobble boards and stuff like that.
I was literally going to get to that. So
if we go to the those like vibratory stations. I was going to
so if, certainly in field sports, people say to me about, unstable surface training. And I'm saying, it's the stable surface that we're playing on. And if there's instability coming anywhere in field-based sports, it's coming from the upper body. So I think I've kind of mellowed a little bit in my career and said, yes, there's probably is a place for it, but you have to introduce that instability from above the floor. But obviously your guys are competing on a moving surface. Where does that come in for you?
So I would think if the athletes is just not conditioned and not strong, then I would go after that first. For me, the biggest thing is if you're, we have a trampoline for the snowboard kids, so they do a lot. I think that's really important that they're inverted regularly, so they can pick landing. So for the snowboard guys, it's slightly different. And again, they're fixed on a board. So that both feet are fixed. For skiing, I think it's slightly different. I think your ability to control your leg, but in downhill, their turn is 0.9 of a second. So it's not very fast. It's you're holding pressure. So it's an isometric or a quasi-isometric with maybe an eccentric as you come through it. It's not like tut, 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 tut. So plyos, it's not a very plyometric sport. I'll come back to that because I don't necessarily agree with that. And then slalom, I think, is 0.4, something like that. The second one, they're changing direction. So it's still in relative athletic ability, quite slow. Yeah. Compared to something like a sidestep in rugby.
Or even like a vertical jumps half a second.
Yeah. So, you know, it's not that fast. Again, they're not on something that's doing this. They're on a surface that's sliding and you're reacting to sliding. So my thing is, I would rather them spend more time on snow working. In the Netherlands, we've got snow domes. So I'm like, go and work on those technical skills and be exposed in those positions because you can't replicate those angles in the gym. Yeah. If it's a strength quality, if it's a quality that you're lacking, let's look with the technical coach on what quality you are missing and in what range and what position and what contraction spectrum. And there's points where I'll go, I don't think we can do this around it, but I think they would be better off doing a drill very much down the line that you are drilling on snow. So taking concepts from rugby and or coaching and breaking the drill, the movement down to a slower speed, getting into the angle, holding it for longer, and building that back up to higher velocities would be where I would be on that. I think that's a much better use of our time. If there's an underlying quality that's not good and we can develop that quality in the gym, brilliant. All that balancing and fun stuff, I think, is fun, and it adds an element of entertainment to the athlete and it creates a novel stimulus for the athlete. And they should be able to cope with most of that, but it would be a small part of the program and not the totality of the program.
Do you have, you know, elite athletes in those squads that suck at that kind of stuff? Because I mean, you see all these like ridiculous circus obstacle courses on Instagram. Would you have international level athletes like that are not good at that?
Yeah, because we don't do that the whole time, but they're still an international athlete. Yeah. We go through phases of doing them. Like I won't say that we don't do them. We have some. I'm lucky that a lot of the guys don't buy into it as well. So they're like, I don't see the point. It's not skiing. I don't need to be entertained. So some of the guys are pretty professional. I don't need to be entertained by it. I'm happy to come in and lift. I'm happy to work on the qualities. Better conversations about what are you not good at and what you need to get better at. Let's sit and ask them why they think that, what could be the reason. And then they generally have an answer. And then you generally have a solution. If they can pick the problem and tell you why they think the problem is there, then you can generally work quite easily with them.
Revolutionary.
Yeah, it's not rocket science. That's why we're in it. So I think better questions with the athletes, better, you know, the thing I'm probably most proud of was I was teaching on a master's program one day and I showed the guys the movement screens of a couple of athletes just out of fun, and they could tell me exactly what was wrong to a really high level. And then I had a bunch of master's level people who couldn't, you know, and that's just from them asking questions, being around sport for quite a long time. They understood good movement and what was important. And getting them, they write programs now. They write programs for the staff, which is fun. So getting back to, we do have elements of balance. So I always have single leg work. I always have jumping and landing. I always have, we have chaos. So I think you need uncontrolled, I think with a performance, they talk about this, is that structure of chaos into it. If it's all chaos and no control, then you've no control. If you have structured chaos to unstructured chaos, I think that's a great environment to have. And then you have to play up.
Jordan Peterson now, order and chaos.
Yeah, Yes, we are. So I think you have to have, somebody might love the chaos, but not have the skill set to manage it, or the underlying qualities, or again, if they're, sometimes people go, let's go wakeboarding. And wakeboarding is very transferable for a snowboarder, but the landing's very different. So we got a lot of injuries from people wakeboarding. We have one or two really good wakeboarders in the team, and they go wakeboarding because they can land differently, and the risk factor for them is much less. Again, they're both extreme sports. We don't say no. And then some of the other guys, it's trampoline. Some of the other guys, it's parkour. I'd much rather than do something like that. That's an expression, has creativity, that they're still manipulating the body in the air.
Maybe I'm just throwing it out there, but like when you go from the team sports to individual sports, just the one person may have like this huge universe around them with all these minor details. Like, when you see the 100-meter sprints and they just break down every single thing. And for rugby, it's just run forward, pass backwards. If anyone's not dressed like you, just bring them down. And we make it complicated, but it's actually like pretty straightforward.
Well, I mean, snowboarding is the same. If I speak to the technical coaches, it's the first 3 setup turns, spin really fast and land.
Simple is not easy. Simple is not easy. Yeah. So, where's a good place to find you online when your guys get all these gold medals and people want to hire you?
I think I just changed my Instagram because my wife told me to, my handle. I can't remember what I changed it to.
Was it Athletic Evolution?
It was Athletic Evolution, but there's somebody else called Athletic Evolution in the UK as well. So it was, I think it's RW Performance Coach, or one word, on Instagram. And then actually the other one is Skeleton Bob. So 130 kilometers an hour face first on a tea tray. So I think that's the other, again, I think the mental aspect of these sports is pretty big. And when we were talking about recovery earlier, is they might do, a Skeleton Bob athlete will do 2, maybe 3 runs in a day. And the fatigue from that is they're just pushing for maybe 20 meters and then they're on the sled. But the mental concentration of traveling at 120 kilometers an hour to 130, the vibration that they have can smoke them mentally and neurologically for a couple of days. So maybe with that athlete, that's one of the athletes that I've done in season over the last couple of years working with them. We do hardly any training in season. We are minimum effective dose to keep them as fast as possible, as recovered as possible, so they can learn tracks, concentrate on performing and riding really well. So I would say with that athlete within that sport, we're the furthest away from 90% of my job is saying, no, let's do less. Let's do less. Let's do even less again. And that decision making has been incredibly well supported by our sports science staff in challenging me a lot, looking at data together and going, am I going to be the limiting factor for this performance, or is this going to be supportive and help this athlete do what they need to do? And again, that's probably one of the other ones where we capture a lot of data on that athlete in terms of wellness, jump scores, VBT, and I don't know who said this, but being data informed and not data driven. So looking at having very good data to look at the totality of the experience of that athlete, have better conversations, and look at creating a more fluid plan for that athlete. So probably 10 years ago, I've been very locked into my periodization, and we're going to do this and we're going to do this many sessions. And now I'm like, let's build out bits, see how you recover, have a general overview, and then keep adapting that to keep you performing at the very best of your abilities, which is way more work than having a beautiful planned out, cycle in real depth. We have real depth to it, but where that having it that it's so liquid that you can move it.
I mean, yeah, structured periodization assumes a defined outcome, but when that outcome is always moving, by definition you're forced to be adaptable.
Yeah, and we have weather. We have in snowboarding you have weather, so it's guys going to the Olympics this week, stuff changed. So you're getting a phone call going, the weather's terrible. What am I going to do for the next 4 days? And you suddenly have the opportunity, or they go to a camp for 2 weeks and they don't go up. So you have a block within the season that you didn't have before to top up physical capabilities. So, so getting back to those points that you said, I think that's one of the things, if I was to go back into team sports, is really look at, are we covering our ass by doing a lot of sessions?
This is Japan in a nutshell. If you can get to the point of actively doing so much work that it makes you worse and it increases your chance of losing. But when you lose, you can pat yourself on the back and say, oh, but we work so hard. And if you do less and less and less and less and less, and then you lose, you're going to get fired for being lazy. But yeah, man, someone's getting to be a chatty Cathy now. So thanks very much. Sweet.
No worries, mate. No worries.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.